My guest this week is Tidepool CEO Howard Look, here to talk about the very exciting submission of the Loop app to the US FDA. There is so much to talk about here, but Howard, let me just first welcome you to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Stacey. It is so great to be here. I'm so excited to see you again and so grateful for you having me on your show.
Well,
Hi,
thank
everybody.
you. It's funny to look back, and we have a lot to talk about, but I should say, as we're getting started here, I have talked to you many times, but twice for the podcast. And that first time was almost 5 years ago now.
I
So
know.
as we go through this conversation, and as you're watching or listening, there's going to be a lot of presumed knowledge, I think, but we're not going to try to explain everything. So I will link up the previous episodes where we talked about Tidepool in its early days, and then
Yeah.
the announcement a couple of years ago about this. But I think even just a quick cursory Google search will get you up to date before you listen to the interview. But there's a lot here. So Howard, thanks again. Let's dive right in.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
What did you all submit? Tell me about what actually went to the FDA.
I have learned more about how FDA submissions go than I ever imagined in my whole life. So we submitted what is known as a 510K application, which is a big set of documents that says to the FDA, here's what we have built, and here's how we built it, and here is the work that we did to show clinical evidence, to show software, cybersecurity, what's called verification data, how we know that the software is working as intended. It describes what it looks like, how it works, what the requirements are, and all of that ended up being about a 2,000-page submission, which sounds like a lot, but I've heard that other submissions are far, far bigger. So we feel like it was a well-crafted submission, and we are now in the thick of what is called FDA interactive review. So we sent in our submission on December 17th. Turns out that was a snow day in Washington, D.C., so that was interesting. So our lawyer's office used a courier to get a DVD-ROM and deliver it to Silver Springs, Maryland. And what the FDA got was a bunch of documentation about Tidepool Loop.
So when I said no presumed knowledge, some presumed knowledge here, but let's go a little deeper into that. So you submitted Tidepool Loop. This is an app. What are you, I guess we can fast forward. What would the finished product be?
So Tidepool Loop is a mobile application. Once it is cleared by the FDA, and I have to be super clear, it has not yet been cleared by the FDA. It is currently under review, so it is not yet available. But once it is cleared, Tidepool Loop will be a mobile application for iPhone, and people will be able to get it just like you get any other iPhone app by going to the App Store and downloading it. It will be prescription required. So you'll have to go to your endo or your doctor and say, this is something I would like, and get a prescription code. And then people will be able to download that app from the App Store. And what Tidepool Loop will do is it'll connect to insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitors. And it's what's called an automated insulin delivery device, or AID, some people call it. Other people call it closed loop or artificial pancreas. But basically, it's software that automatically controls insulin delivery based on glucose values and based on predicting how your body is going to react to insulin and carbohydrates. And it automatically uses an algorithm, or math, a fancy word for math, to decide how much insulin you should get. So a long-winded answer, Tidepool Loop is a mobile app that controls insulin delivery.
Well, it's not long-winded at all, because I know there's a lot more to it than just that even. But to be clear, when I think about this, and I would love to talk more about the history and DIY and so much of that. It basically is the brains of the operation. So you have your pump, you have your CGM, but you need that program. So, we have the Control IQ, we have Horizon with Omnipod, if I'm getting that right. It used to be Type 0, which we may see in other pumps. This is that?
That's exactly
Like
right.
this,
So
yeah.
there's three pieces to an automated insulin delivery system. There's the insulin pump, which I think most people are familiar with, but it holds a reservoir of insulin, and sometimes it's something that you clip to your belt, like a Medtronic pump or a Tandem pump, and sometimes it's a self-contained unit like an Omnipod that sticks right on your skin. So that's component number one is the insulin pump. Component number two is the continuous glucose monitor. And the one that I think a lot of people are familiar with is the Dexcom G6. That's a super popular continuous glucose monitor, or CGM. But there are others out there as well. And then the third piece is this controller piece in the middle. And what the controller piece does is it takes information from the continuous glucose monitor. It also takes other information such as what your insulin to carb ratio is, what your insulin sensitivity factor is, knowledge about your basal rates, and it combines all that information using math and determines how much insulin you should be getting. And what's cool about it, people living with type 1 diabetes are used to that and used to doing the math on a napkin to figure out what their dose should be. But what's cool about it is that the software does it for you. And in the case of most automated insulin delivery systems, it does it automatically every 5 minutes, which is great because that's a lot of math and it's doing it for you. And it's also paying attention to how your body is reacting to what happened previously. And that's why it's called a closed loop system. It delivers insulin, it determines information, and then that brings that information back into the system to determine what it should do on the next iteration of the loop.
And it really has been amazing. I mean, I mentioned Control IQ, and I had no idea, even though I had been told it could make, 300 decisions a day,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
one every 5 minutes and then an additional one every hour. I remember the first morning I checked and it had kept Benny at, like, let's say 110 or 105 or
yeah.
115, some great number I was so excited to see. And I thought, oh, well, it didn't have to work very hard last night because he was just cruising. And then I went
Mm-hmm,
into
mm-hmm.
the pump and it had adjusted every 5 minutes
It's
to keep him
incredible.
there. I don't know why I hadn't thought about it that way, that it would have to work just as hard, right, to keep him at that number. And it's not something that most people really have the inclination to sit there, and do all day long. It was amazing to me. Just in a way, Howard, I got to tell you, and you'll get this as a parent of a child with type 1, it kind of assuaged my guilt of not being perfect all these
Oh
years.
yeah, yeah. I know exactly what you mean. So our daughter Katie, she's 21 now, but she was
Wow.
diagnosed with type 1 when she was 11. And I know exactly what you're talking about. As a parent, that feeling of, why can't I get this right? How can I do more? Why is this so hard? And the answer is because it's freaking hard. It
Yeah.
is really hard work. And these systems are taking that really hard work and bottling a whole bunch of it up into these decisions that it can make every 5 minutes. And even they have to work hard. If you actually look at what the systems are doing, they're adjusting insulin delivery up or down every 5 minutes. And they're doing their best, and it's still really hard. And so, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And realizing what we as parents did, getting up multiple times during the night, giving correction doses, trying to get it right, like we all deserve a gold star for that because it is freaking hard work.
you know,
And everyone living with type 1
of
deserves a
course,
gold star too, because
of
it's
course.
it's not just us parents, like people living with type 1 have
Yeah,
been doing this for decades.
exactly. With no breaks.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so I have a lot of specific questions about
Yeah.
Tidepool that my listeners have sent in. I'm cautious about getting too specific. I'm going to ask you. You may have to say, "Can't answer that. Can't answer that." But before I do, I'd love to take a moment and talk about, the significance of this being something that started as part of the DIY community. I was looking back, and my podcast started in 2015, but We Are Not Waiting and started, really, that saying came in 2013, but people were working on things like this before that.
Yeah.
What's the significance, as you see it, of, my understanding is this is the first kind of crowdsourced DIY diabetes component, I'm not really sure what else to call it, to go in front of the FDA. It seems like we should just kind of stop and mark that.
I agree. There is so much to celebrate about this story, and what you just mentioned is one of the huge components. So, Tidepool Loop is based on an open source project that was known as Loop. I usually call it DIY lube just to differentiate it, but it was just known as lube. And there's a wonderful Medium blog post by Nate Raycliffe, who was the original author of Lube. And he talks about how the work he did was built on top of the work that people did before him. People like Ben West and John Kostick, who figured out how to control diabetes devices over wireless communication protocols. And then Pete Schwamb, his daughter is named Riley, and Pete went and taught himself hardware design so that he could invent the Riley link, which made it possible to control at first Medtronic insulin pumps and then later Omnipod pumps remotely from an iPhone over Bluetooth. So it's this really incredible story of innovation, of people figuring out how to make this happen. There's a whole other wonderful blog post that for your technically minded readers about the reverse engineering efforts that went into figuring out how to control the Omnipod and how to add that functionality into Loop, which at the time only could control Medtronic pumps. And so it just goes on and on and on. There's a gentleman named Joe Moran who was instrumental. He's been living with type 1 for decades, and he was instrumental to that effort. And so there's the open APS community and the Android APS community, Dana Lewis and Scott Librand, who I know you've met. And the story is that when the community really wants to do something, they just go figure it out. It's to me, the most incredible example of tenacity and innovation and grit and everyone working together for the greater good. And all of that transpired with people just doing their thing on their own, nights and weekends, or, none of them, all of those names that I mentioned, it wasn't their day job to go do that. They did it because they wanted to help improve lives, their own lives or the people they love living with type 1 diabetes. And so what we did at Tidepool is we saw how popular Loop or DIY Loop was. My daughter started using it when she was still in high school 6 years ago and was getting incredible results. A bunch of other Tidepoolers were using it. And we thought to ourselves, you know what? We're in a really interesting position as a nonprofit, as an open source organization that has chosen to engage deeply with the FDA, that we could take this open source project built by the We Are Not Waiting community, and we could actually bring it into our regulatory quality system. And we could take it to the FDA and say, hey, FDA, we actually would like to make this broadly available. We would like to put it in the App Store. And we started floating this idea with everyone, with the We Are Not Waiting community, with the device makers that would have to cooperate, with the FDA, with the funding organizations like JDRF and the Helmsley Charitable Trust. And across the board, everybody thought it was a great idea. And so that was really, to me, it was just so heartwarming to know that everybody agreed, yes, this needs to happen. It can't, these great systems that are helping our kids sleep through the night and helping us achieve, really great lower burden control of our diabetes, that we want to do our part to now pay it forward and help make it broadly available. So I couldn't be more thankful and grateful to that entire community. So I often say we are standing on the shoulders of giants, the We Are Not Waiting giants.
That's great. All right. So now let's get down to the nitty gritty, because people want to know what this is really going to look like. When the FDA approves it, what are they approving? Is it for use with just Omnipod? I know you haven't agreed with Medtronic. What starts out of the gate?
So the first thing, I have to be super careful because this is not yet an FDA cleared product, and the FDA has very strict rules about marketing a product before it's actually available. So I'm just going to make a statement up front that I will probably repeat over and over. I'm going to describe the process to you that we are going through, but I'm not yet describing a product that is cleared by the FDA, and we are not yet approved to market this. So what we can do, because we're a nonprofit and because we're radically transparent, we share everything that we're doing with the community. So all of our engagement with the FDA, for example, we've openly published on our website. So your listeners and who want to actually see what we've talked to the FDA about can go to tidepool.org/documents and see all of the interactions we've had over the years that I'm about to describe. So here's what I can say openly, transparently, publicly. We have announced that Tidepool, the organization, has development agreements with Dexcom, with Medtronic, and with Insulet. What I can't say is the other device makers that we are also working with. I can just say that there are other device makers. Every device maker has their own time frame about when they are comfortable talking about it. And so the first pair of device makers that we announced were Insulet, Omnipod, and Dexcom with the Dexcom G6. And that's really notable because they have already gone to the agency and they themselves have submitted their devices for clearance in this interoperable ecosystem. So I should, if you want me to, I should probably take a little sidebar here and talk about interoperability and how all that
Yes,
works.
you may certainly take us out into what I
Okay.
call the Mr. Potato Head aspect of diabetes technology. So the floor is yours.
Super. So the FDA really gets a huge amount of credit here because they went to industry, to all of us in the diabetes device business, and they said, hey, all y'all diabetes device companies, this is way too hard when you come to us with these big giant submissions for these big giant systems that include all of those components that I talked about earlier, the pump, the CGM, the controller, and everything that has to go with it. So we, the FDA, would like you to start thinking differently. And what they did is they issued what are called de novos, which is where they make a new product classification. De novo literally means from the new. And so it's a new product classification for interoperable components. And they created 3 different components: the iCGM, or integrated continuous glucose monitor, the ACE pump, or alternate controller enabled insulin infusion pump, and the IAGC, the interoperable automated glycemic controller. So those 3 de novos are critical because they allow a company like us to say, hey, FDA, I'm not coming to you with an entire system that does all 3 things together. I'm just coming to you with one piece. So we have submitted an IAGC, the interoperable automated glycemic controller. Dexcom submitted the iCGM. Insulet submitted an ACE pump and has also been talking about their future ACE pump roadmap. Tandem did the same thing. What's notable about Tandem is they submitted an ACE pump and an IAGC.
Right.
So you were mentioning the type 0 algorithm earlier. The algorithm that is known as Control IQ started its life as the type 0 algorithm. So they submitted both an ACE pump, which is the Tandem X2 platform, and the IAGC, which is known as Control IQ technology, which, as you know, started its life as the type 0 algorithm. So we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the agency for creating that interoperable pathway.
I'm going to probably ask you a bunch of questions that you will answer just like that. And I'll try my best not to put you on the spot. But you know that while there is a large component of people very interested in the history and the alphabet soup and everything you went through, there's also a large amount of people who say, when this thing comes out, can I slap it onto my Omnipod and use it?
Yes.
So the question then becomes, does it matter what type? And again, if you can't answer this, I totally understand. Yeah. Does it matter what type of pod they're using? Because we have Dash, we have Eros, and I don't use Omnipod, so I may be getting this wrong. And then we have Omnipod 5 with Horizon coming out later this year. So people are saying, Howard, what do I stock up on?
I see. I can't specifically say what will be cleared by the FDA because it hasn't been cleared yet, but I can tell you what the intent of Tidepool Loop is. So Tidepool Loop is intended to be an IAGC, an interoperable automated glycemic controller. And in order to be that type of device, it can only work with iCGM or ACE pumps. So it will not be able to work with anything that does not have an ACE pump designation, and it will not be able to work with anything that does not have an iCGM designation.
Got it. Okay. And then my next question is, and this comes back to, I think I asked you this the very first time when you announced that you were hoping to shepherd Loop to the
Hmm.
FDA. And it's an interoperability question that I still can't wrap my brain around.
Sure.
So, and I'll give you an example of something that, we'll stay on the Omnipod. So I'll give you the example of Omnipod. So I'm very excited this fall. I get my Omnipod 5 with Horizon. It's got its own hybrid closed loop system or whatever they're calling it these days.
Hmm.
And then I hear, oh, Tidepool is out and I want to go to the App Store and get Loop.
Hmm.
Do I flip a switch on my Omnipod PDM? Or do I have to right now? Because I know you're talking about interoperability in the future and lots of
Hmm.
great things. But what happens now? Can I switch to it or do I have to pick one and then stay in that? Even though it's the software.
I don't believe people will be locked in. So there is no, well, I shouldn't speak for Insulet, but
Right.
there is no switch on the PDM. Pods, the way pods work is they can pair to one controller at a time, but pods are disposable. So if you pair one controller to a pod, you can pair the next pod to a different controller. So that would be the idea there. There's no switch that you flip. The idea with Tidepool Loop would be as a different kind of controller that you wouldn't need to use your PDM. You would use Tidepool Loop on your phone instead.
Great. I think everybody's going to, hopefully they all want to go to phone anyway. And that's what everyone seems to be working for. And I know I'm asking you questions that are also for Omnipod and you really can't answer them. So we will talk to Omnipod down the road and find out more. So let's go back to Loop. A bunch of questions about
Hmm.
the targets, because one of the things that people love so much about DIY is that
Hmm.
they can really set these target ranges for how they want and other
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
Can you speak to that? What kind of flexibility as compared to what people understand with DIY Loop may they
Right.
experience with Tidepool Loop?
Yeah, it's a super question. The first thing I will say is we totally understand how the community loves having the flexibility of choosing their own target range, set points, and we believe in that as well. That is definitely something that tide poolers who use DIY Loop understand the value in that. My daughter uses DIY Loop. I've been very public about that. So we did, in our submission to the agency, propose flexible set points. We are in review right now.
Hmm.
That is something new. And most companies before us have submitted with fixed set points or a limited set of set points. And so that is something that we are discussing with the agency. We're not yet cleared, so I can't tell you how that discussion will go. What I can tell you is the agency has been great. They have been so good during this review. I know a lot of people like to dump on the FDA. I will not do that because my experience with the agency has been these are hardworking, really dedicated public servants that really want the best, safest, and most effective solutions for the community. And the questions they have asked us about our clinical study data, about how we built the product, about cybersecurity, is all completely reasonable. And so I know they are seriously considering it. And we're hoping we will know the answer to how that's going to go soon.
Well, it's interesting too, because as I mentioned kind of offhandedly, everybody's working towards bolus from phone and control from
Mm-hmm.
phone. And sure, many of them, the more, I guess I can't say commercial and leave you all out now, but many of the traditional commercial systems are working toward that. Would
Yep.
you mind sharing a little bit about how Loop, well, I'm not going to say how it works because that's not what I mean, but what would I
Mm-hmm.
see? Can you share a little bit how it looks on the phone? Because that's so novel for so many of us that haven't even thought about that before, used it before in our phones.
Yeah, well, it's a little tricky. I wish I could just bring it up on screen and show it to you. What I will tell you is for your listeners that are used to what DIY looks like, Tidepool Loop will look extremely familiar.
Okay.
There are a few, we've changed some colors and moved some icons around, but it'll still look extremely familiar to anyone who has seen DIY Loop before. For folks who haven't seen what Loop looks like, you can go to our website. There's a screenshot of the home screen. And obviously, once it's cleared, we will publish all kinds of more information about what all the screens look like. But anyone who has seen DIY Loop and understands the home screen with the glucose chart, the insulin chart, with the buttons that let you bolus and do target, pre-meal targets, et cetera, it'll all look extremely familiar in Tidepool Loop.
Is it Apple and Android submitted? Or?
We submitted only for iPhone for now, and the reason for that is DIY Loop is only for iPhone. So the fastest path to us submitting and to getting it out into the community was to go with what already existed. That said, we absolutely are committed to building an Android version. We're also committed to going outside the US, which is also the next question I usually get asked.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so we are a small company. We, like any good small company, are staying focused on one thing at a time and making sure we do that one thing well. So that one thing right now is getting it in the App Store in the US, approved by the FDA, and then moving on to Android and outside the US is absolutely on our roadmap. And stay tuned. I don't want to overset expectations about when all that's going to happen, but we definitely will get to it.
Excellent. Yes, that was one of the questions. I'm curious though, for somebody, I don't even use my son's pump anymore. He's 16. I don't even see
Mhm,
anything anymore. But I'm curious, in your studies with folks and somebody who has used
mhm,
DIY or your daughter has used for a long time,
mhm.
is there anything different when you do use your phone as the controller? Other than convenience, I'm wondering if there's anything noticeable and different about it.
Well, I think what people report, people who have been using DIY Loop, because no one has used Tidepool Loop on their body yet, but people who use DIY Loop report that the freedom and convenience of having the interface on the thing that you're carrying anyway is really wonderful. And Loop also includes an Apple Watch component. And I know a lot of people find that really liberating to be able to manage your diabetes right from your wrist. So I think what we've heard from DIY Loop users is, hey, look, I've got my phone with me all the time anyway. I'm looking at my phone all the time anyway. It's just so nice to be able to just interact with my diabetes using this thing that I use all the time anyway.
Wow. So just to be clear, you can control it from the watch as well, or that's what you've
Yes,
submitted. Okay,
yes.
cool. Um, in the clinical trials or the testing that you had to do for the submission, what came out? I mean, there was so much kind of, I don't know if it's off the record information for DIY, but I imagine that with Tidepool Loop, you really did you have to demonstrate better control or just safety?
So this is another fascinating part of the story and how the community contributed to the success of Loop. The FDA, very early on, when we started talking to them about the possibility of submitting Loop, said to us very clearly, we love real world evidence. And so the clinical study data that we submitted with the 510K application for Tidepool Loop is actually clinical data that came out of the Loop observational study of the do it yourself Loop community. And this is really an incredible study because it had over 1,000 people in it, over 700 of whom were actively uploading data. And the amount of data in this study is staggering. As a matter of fact, the total person years or person days of study data in this study, if you take the Control IQ pivotal study, the Basal IQ pivotal study, the Medtronic 670G pivotal study, and add it all up, the Loop observational study of DIY Loop has 3 times as much data
Wow.
submitted as those studies, or 3 times as much data that was collected during the study. So it's really a staggering amount of data, and we are really just overwhelmingly indebted to the community, to all the people who participated in that study. And that was the foundation for the clinical evidence that we submitted with Tidepool Loop, which is a pretty amazing thing. And I don't know that that has been done in that way before. Now, the data that is from that study has been published. So for your listeners who want to learn more, there are a couple places you can go. The Jabe Center for Health Research published a paper, and I'm sure a quick Google search will turn it up. It's called the Loop Observational Study. It's also on clinicaltrials.gov. And if you want to see the presentation that was shown at last year's ATTD in Madrid, right before coronavirus
Mm.
or was in full swing, February of last year, that's on our website at tidepool.org/documents. So
Yeah.
to answer your question, what was interesting? What was interesting is how broad the use of Loop was. It was down to people under 2 years old, and there were people in their 70s. There were people from all walks of life. It was just really fascinating to me. Remember, this is a real world study. This was not a controlled intervention study. There wasn't a randomized control arm of people not using it. It was just observing life of people using it. And so to me, that was the fascinating part, was
Yeah.
that so many people were willing to raise their hand and say, I want to help donate my data, and I'm going to show you how it works for me.
And we'll link up those studies that you mentioned, but I assume that they were good studies. In other words, that people were happy with their A1Cs, their time in range, ease of use, safety, all that stuff.
The data, so it looks great. There's some really fascinating outcomes. The way it works with the agency is only the FDA can say what's safe and effective.
Ah,
So we present the data to them. Here we say, here's why we think it is safe and effective. But at the end of the day, the FDA is the one that gets to say, yes, we agree, and therefore you are now FDA cleared.
you've already mentioned this several times, but Tidepool has always stood out for being very open source, very open with information, publishing everything that you can, saying as much as you can. I am curious that now that you have gone through something like this,
Mhm.
are you happy that you did it that way? Would you do it that way again?
So the part about being an open and transparent organization, I love. I think it is a great way to go. And I know it's not for every company. There's great value to big commercial companies like Apple choosing to keep their product plans secret and then doing a huge launch and saying, ta-da, here's what we've done. For us as a small nonprofit with the mission of supporting the diabetes community, I think it's a great way to go, because it allows us to be really clear that, look, our motives are not about profit. Our motives are about doing the right thing for the
Mm,
community. And to me, the openness and transparency just makes all that completely clear. There's another part of the story, which is doing it as a nonprofit. We happen to be doing both. We're open and transparent, and we're a
yeah.
501c3 nonprofit. That part is tricky. I will be honest, especially during the pandemic. A lot of nonprofits, including us, have been hit hard, and that's been really challenging. It is much easier for a for-profit company to weather a storm if they've got a venture capitalist willing to give them funding, or they can take out a loan. As a nonprofit, that has been challenging. Would I do it the same way again? I totally would. None of us could have predicted the pandemic, so it
Sure.
is what it is.
So, and here again, it's another question I'm not sure that you can answer. So, with your nonprofit status,
Hmm.
if I decide after FDA approval and I can go
Uh-huh.
to the app store with my prescription from my doctor,
Uh-huh.
am I paying for it? Is my health insurance paying for it?
So here's where we are, and I will be open and transparent about this, which is we don't know yet.
Ah,
So as a nonprofit, our goal is to make the software as broadly available as we possibly can. We are engaging in commercial deals with some of these device makers so that they will actually give us money when people start using Loop, because obviously we're bringing new customers to them that are going to keep buying supplies and pumps and CGMs from them. We would love to keep the price as low as possible. And if there's any way we can do it, we want to make it free.
wow.
We're not sure we can yet. We've got to project out how it's going to go. We do have, we have people on staff and we have to pay them. We're not going to do it as a way of making money the way a for-profit company would. We don't have to answer to investors. We don't have to answer to the stock market. We would only do that if it helps us be a self-sustaining organization and it helps us continue to deliver on our mission.
Wow. So many. It's fascinating to think about the the questions you start asking when you start going down this road of, as you said, nonprofit and open source
Hmm.
and everything else. Um, and on that road, there are rumblings. They're not really there yet of other possibly DIY rooted projects that are waiting to see what happens with you guys. Right. So if you can, it's kind of like when Medtronic got the
Hmm.
670 approved, and then other people said, okay, we can now take our
Hmm.
product and we'll probably get it through the FDA with a lower, time and range and without calibration and things
Hmm.
like that.
Hmm.
Do you think that after Tidepool, and I'm not asking you to comment on any specific, I don't even have any specific companies or
Yeah.
products in mind. Is this going to be the start of a different kind of diabetes technology? approved by the FDA? Like in 5 years, could we have different, like you already mentioned open EPS and different things that you've built on. I wonder if there's somebody working on something today
Mhm.
that because of the Tidepool submission would have an
Mhm.
easier time coming through. So I asked you about 3 questions in there. Sorry.
I sure hope that this is the start of a revolution in how new diabetes technology is created and delivered to market. Whether it ends up being open source projects or it's because we share all of our source code, we share our regulatory quality management system openly. We will publish our 510K submission once we get through interactive review and clearance. And we're doing that because we want to help other people. Like for us, it's a win. If there's lots more technology coming out that gives the diabetes community more choice, and that allows our kids and people living with diabetes and to have better solutions that fit better in their lives, that's a big win. Like we've got no ego invested in this. I want lots of companies, whether for profit or nonprofit, whether based on open source or closed source, it kind of doesn't matter. What I want to see happen is innovation, and I want that innovation to happen more quickly and get into the hands of people who can use it more quickly.
That's
That's
great.
the win for us.
Yeah. As we start to wrap up here, my interoperability
Mhm.
questions still are out there. And again, I know that you cannot speak to different products, and that's fine. Or
Yeah.
maybe you can, and that's fine too. But when I think of true interoperability, and my ecosystem is limited just because of what my son uses, but I think of, okay, if I want to use this controller,
Yep.
whether it's Tidepool Loop, Control IQ, or Omnipod
Mhm.
Horizon, whatever, and I want to use a Libre, and I want to use this pump, or I want to use a Dexcom, or I want to use the
Mhm.
Dana pump, or whatever. There's all these pumps and CGMs coming to market. Are we going to see that anytime soon? Is it insurmountable? Is it really going to happen? I mean, I'm hopeful, but you know, it's a long time coming.
I am very optimistic that true interoperability is on its way. And one of the huge reasons we are doing what we're doing is to show that that is actually doable. You should be able to pick the pump that's right for you. You should be able to pick the CGM that's right for you. You should be able to pick the controller and the user experience that's right for you. I do imagine that there is a world where you can say, you know what, I'm the pregnant mom living with type 1, or I'm the athlete living with type 1, and I have very different needs. And the system should be able to adapt to you, and you should be able to choose which thing is stuck to your body to work best for you. So I am very, very optimistic that interoperability is happening, and we are pushing on it, and I believe the FDA wants it to happen too. That's
That'd be
why they
great.
made these interoperability pathways.
All right, one more question before I let you go here. I remember when I saw one of your presentations on the shoulders of giants
Mhm.
presentations a while ago. One of the things that people really like, in addition to the wonderful blood sugar control they get from DIY Loop, they really like the icons. There's like ice cream and pizza. There's all this neat little stuff in the app. Are you able to share it? Could you save any of the cute stuff?
The
Is it
cute
all
stuff is
medical
still
now?
there. It is
Oh,
the cute stuff is still there. Like I said, the experience of Tidepool Loop will look very familiar to users of DIY Loop. And one of the things that people love about DIY Loop is the ability to use emojis to indicate the type of food you're having, whether it's the lollipop for fast-acting carbs or pizza for the very long-acting carbs, and all the emojis in between. So that's something that people love about DIY Loop, and we have maintained that in Tidepool
I said it was my last question. I lied. I meant to
Loop.
ask you the first time I talked to you in 2016, we were talking about Tidepool as a data company, right?
Yeah,
I want to see my data. I want to free the data. Is that still part of the mission? Is that still something that's part of the core of Tidepool moving forward?
it absolutely is. So at Tidepool, we like to say our mission is to make diabetes data more meaningful and actionable. And seeing all your data in one place is still absolutely part of our mission. Tidepool Web and Tidepool Uploader are incredibly popular. As a matter of fact, we have about 3 times as many users now as we had before the pandemic started.
Wow.
Because when there's a pandemic, it turns out you need a way to upload your data so that your
Yeah.
daughter can see it remotely. And so that is absolutely still a part of what we're doing, and making diabetes data meaningful, actionable is still absolutely part of what we do.
Awesome. Well, Howard, you've been so generous with your time. I appreciate it so much. Just one more thing is how's your daughter doing? You've got 3 kids. You've got
Yes.
one child with type 1, but
Yeah.
you're like an empty nester almost at this point.
We are an empty nesters, but Katie is doing great. Thank you for asking. She's in college, and she is doing wonderfully. I will tell her you asked about her.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all the information. Come on back when, and I will say when, you get FDA approval and we can share lots more details. But I think this is phenomenal. I'm so excited to just kind of be part of the information stream of the last couple of years. And it's just been so much fun to follow this. So thanks for coming on, Howard.
Well, thanks for all of your amazing questions, and it's just been so great to have you be with us and sharing our story over the years. And so we're really, really grateful to you and all your listeners.